Was he out of his mind? Somebody screamed as I climbed over the collapsed fence toward a shed already swallowed by fire. Another man grabbed the back of my coat. "Don't go in there. There's propane inside." Then, through the smoke, I heard a child scream. I pulled free. 4 days earlier, I had held my wife Carol's hand while she took her last breath after 39 years of marriage. That afternoon, I had scattered her ashes over the water she loved. And less than 2 hours before this fire, my own children had been too busy to pick me up from the station. Now 2 children I had never met were trapped behind a burning door, and all I could think was, I am not watching another family lose someone tonight. I grabbed a cinder block, smashed the small window, reached through the broken glass, and forced the latch open. Smoke hit me like a wall. Somewhere inside, a boy coughed and cried, "Please, my brother." I stepped into the fire. Before I tell you what happened inside that shed, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if your children left you alone on the day you scattered your spouse's ashes, could you forgive them? Subscribe to Family Dominion, because by the next morning my children would discover what I had done from complete strangers. My name is Walter Pruitt. I'm 64, and for 31 years I worked as a machinist. I was never important, never wealthy, never the kind of man people put on television. Carol used to say I could repair anything except my habit of pretending I didn't need anybody. Maybe that was why I sent the text at all. After scattering her ashes at the Cape May Pier, I caught the 4:10 train home carrying one canvas bag and wearing the wedding ring I still couldn't imagine removing. When the train pulled in shortly after 6, families were waiting along the platform. Nobody was waiting for me. I sat there until nearly everyone had left, then opened our family thread. Pulling in at 6, "Any chance one of you can swing by?" Asking my own children for a ride felt harder than it should have. Gary answered first. "Kind of swamped tonight. Just take the train home. You know the way." Rachel replied a few minutes later. "Dad, you really should have told us earlier so we could plan around it." I stared at those words. Plan around it. Their mother had died 4 days earlier. I had just carried what remained of her to the place where she wanted to rest, and all I wanted was one familiar face on that platform. I could have told them that. Instead, I typed, "No problem." Then I put my phone away and started home alone. A light rain followed me through the side streets. My knees hurt, my bag felt heavier with every block, and for the first time since Carol died, I understood how quiet my life had become. Near Larkspur Lane, I helped a young mother lift a stroller over a broken step. She thanked me and said, "Hope somebody returns the favor someday." I smiled. Me too. 30 seconds later, someone screamed. Smoke was rising behind the houses. I ran toward it and saw flames tearing through an old backyard shed. Neighbors stood along the fence, shouting that 2 boys were still inside. Someone had called 911, but the fire trucks weren't there yet. Nobody moved toward the shed. Then I heard the younger boy scream. 31 years around industrial machinery had given me enough emergency training to know how quickly smoke could kill. I dropped my bag. A neighbor grabbed my arm. "Sir, wait for the firefighters." But waiting was something I had done enough of. I had waited through 18 months of Carol's treatments. Waited through test results, hospital corridors, and doctors saying, "We'll know more tomorrow." There would be no tomorrow for those boys if everyone kept waiting. So I climbed the fence. I broke the window. I opened the door. And as black smoke rolled over me, I heard one boy somewhere in the darkness yell the 2 words that made turning back impossible. "Help us." The smoke swallowed me the moment I stepped inside. I dropped low, covered my mouth with my sleeve, and followed the coughing toward the back wall. "Keep talking," I shouted. A frightened voice answered, "We're here." I found 2 boys huddled beside an overturned table, the younger one crying while his brother held him against the floor where the air was clearer. They looked about 7 and 9. "Listen to me," I said. "We're getting out together." I lifted the younger boy onto my shoulder and told his brother to grab the back of my belt and never let go. Halfway to the door, something crashed behind us, and sparks scattered across the floor. The older boy screamed, but his hand stayed locked around my belt. "Keep moving," I shouted. We stumbled through the doorway into the yard just as their mother came running around the house screaming their names. She dropped to her knees and pulled both boys against her. I tried to step away, but my legs gave out and I sat hard on the wet grass. Only then did I notice blood running from my forearm where the broken window had cut me. Fire engines arrived minutes later. Paramedics checked the boys, while firefighters attacked the shed. One firefighter crouched beside me. "You went inside before we got here?" I nodded. "Those extra minutes mattered," he said. "You may have saved both of them." I looked toward their mother holding her sons and thought of Carol. 4 days earlier, I had been sitting beside a hospital bed wishing somebody could give me just 5 more minutes with her. Tonight, another mother had been given years. That was enough for me. A paramedic wrapped my arm and asked, "Do you have family coming to pick you up?" I almost laughed at the timing. "They're busy tonight." She studied my face, but didn't ask anything else. What I didn't know was that half the neighborhood had recorded the rescue. Doorbell cameras caught me breaking the window. A college kid filmed me disappearing through the smoke. Someone else captured the moment I came out, carrying the younger boy with his brother gripping my belt. Before the fire was completely extinguished, those clips were already being shared online. A local reporter named Marisol Vega approached me with a cameraman. "Mr. Pruitt, the fire chief says those children might not have survived if you had waited. Can we ask why you went inside? They needed help. Were you afraid?" I looked at the blackened shed. Of course. She waited for something more dramatic. I had nothing to give her. "I'm just glad the boys are okay." Marisol lowered her microphone. "Can I at least ask where you were headed when you saw the fire?" I looked down at the canvas bag beside me. Carol's cardigan was still inside. "Home. From where?" I hesitated. "Cape May." "Vacation?" That word nearly broke me. "No. I scattered my wife's ashes today." Marisol's expression changed immediately. "I'm sorry. 39 years, I said quietly. 4 days without her." She told the cameraman to stop recording. That small act made me trust her more than any question could have. A police officer eventually drove me home because the street was blocked by hoses and emergency vehicles. I sat in the back of his cruiser holding Carol's bag against my chest. For the first time since leaving Cape May, I cried. Not because of the fire. Not because my arm hurt. I cried because for 39 years Carol had always asked me to call when I got home safely, and tonight there would be no message waiting from her. When I reached my apartment, I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter without checking it and went to bed. Across town, however, the video was spreading faster than I could have imagined. At 9:17, Gary's phone buzzed while he was eating dinner with Denise. A friend had sent him a link with 5 words. "Isn't this your dad?" Gary pressed play. On his screen appeared the same gray-haired father he had told to find his own way home only hours earlier, running straight into a burning building. Gary watched the video twice before he understood what he was seeing. The first time, he saw smoke, flames, neighbors shouting, and an older man disappearing through a broken window. The second time, he recognized the soaked flannel shirt I had worn to Cape May. "That's Dad," he whispered. Denise moved closer. On the screen, I emerged carrying a little boy, while another clung to my belt. Gary's fork slipped from his hand. Only 3 hours earlier, he had read my message asking for a ride from the station and answered, "Just take the train home. You know the way." Now strangers were cheering as his father collapsed onto wet grass after running into a burning shed. Then the news anchor said, my name. 64-year-old Walter Pruitt is being credited with saving 2 children tonight after entering the structure before firefighters arrived. Denise looked at Gary. "Where was your father coming from?" Gary already knew. He didn't answer. The report continued. Pruitt had reportedly returned to the city shortly after scattering the ashes of his wife of 39 years. Gary went completely still. Denise slowly covered her mouth. "Gary, you knew he was coming home tonight?" He stared at the text thread on his phone. My message was still there. His reply was directly beneath it. For the first time, those words looked different to him. Not practical, not harmless, cold. Across the city, Rachel was sitting beneath a hairdryer when her friend Priya called. "Rachel, is your dad Walter Pruitt?" "Yes." "Why?" "Turn on Channel 9. Rachel laughed nervously. "What happened?" Priya didn't answer the question. "Just turn it on." Rachel's hairdresser propped a phone against the mirror and opened the live report. Rachel watched me break the shed window, disappear into smoke, and emerge with the boys. "Oh my God," she whispered. Then the reporter mentioned Carol. Rachel's face changed. She reached for her own phone and opened our family messages. "Dad, you really should have told us earlier so we could plan around it." She read her sentence again. Her mother's ashes had gone into the ocean that afternoon, and she had answered her grieving father as though he had forgotten to schedule an appointment. "I knew he was coming back," she whispered. Her hairdresser asked, "Was someone supposed to pick him up?" Rachel couldn't answer. She called me immediately. No response. Gary was already calling too. Then Denise called. Then Rachel again. Within 20 minutes, my phone had more than a dozen missed calls, but it was still lying face down on my kitchen counter. Gary drove toward my apartment before Denise stopped him. "If he's sleeping, let him sleep. You don't get to make yourself feel better by waking him up." Gary stared at her. I left him alone. Denise didn't soften it. "Yes." Rachel sat in her car, outside the salon, crying harder than she had at Carol's funeral. She remembered every time I had driven across town when her car broke down, every airport pickup, every midnight call after her divorce. She couldn't remember the last time I had asked her for anything. Tonight, I had asked for one ride. She had told me I should have planned better. By midnight, the rescue video had spread across the city. Strangers were calling me brave. Gary and Rachel were discovering something much harder to live with. While their father had risked his life for 2 children he had never met, his own children had been too busy to meet him at a train station. And neither of them yet knew that inside my quiet house, Carol had left behind something that would make that realization hurt far more. I woke just before 6 and reached across the bed out of habit. My hand found cold sheets. For 3 peaceful seconds, I forgot Carol was gone. Then I saw the bandage around my arm and remembered everything. The fire, the boys, the empty station platform. My phone was still face down on the kitchen counter. When I turned it over, there were 43 missed calls. 17 from Gary, 14 from Rachel, the rest from Denise, relatives, neighbors, and numbers I didn't recognize. There were messages too. "Dad, please call me. Are you okay? We're coming over. Please answer." I stared at them without opening any. The strange part was that I wasn't angry. The night before, when I had needed one person to meet me at the station, everyone had been busy. Now that strangers had watched me run into a fire, everybody suddenly had time. I made coffee and sat in Carol's chair by the window. I didn't call anyone back. Not to punish them. I simply didn't have enough strength to comfort people who had only just realized they should have been worried about me. Around 8, someone knocked. I expected Gary or Rachel. Instead, Marisol Vega stood outside, holding no microphone and followed by no cameraman. "I promise I'm not here for an interview," she said. "The hospital asked me to pass something along. Both boys are going to be fine." I closed my eyes. Of everything that had happened, those were the words I needed most. "The younger one keeps asking about the man who broke the window," she added. I laughed softly. "Tell him the man who broke the window says he should never try that himself." Marisol smiled, then warned me reporters were already gathering near the block. The rescue video had spread overnight. The mayor's office had called the fire department. People wanted interviews, photographs, even some kind of commendation. "I don't want any of it," I said. "I just want quiet." She nodded. "Then I'll keep your address out of my story." After she left, I put my phone face down again. Across town, Gary and Rachel had already used the spare key to enter my house, expecting to find me there. Instead, they walked into the silence Carol had left behind. Her reading chair still faced the window. Her slippers remained beside the bedroom dresser. A small dish on the kitchen table held dried flowers from the memorial. Rachel touched one of them. "Mom's," she whispered. Gary said nothing. For the first time, neither of them had a schedule to hide behind. They saw the house I had returned to alone after scattering their mother's ashes, and the quiet seemed to accuse them more effectively than I ever could. Rachel began straightening things because she needed something to do with her hands. Gary made coffee, then poured it away when he realized he had automatically made 2 cups the way Carol always had. While Rachel searched the hallway closet for cleaning cloths, she moved one of Carol's winter coats and heard metal scrape against the floor. Behind it sat an old gray toolbox. "Gary, did Dad keep tools in here?" He came over. Not that I know of. Rachel pulled it out. The box was heavier than it looked. When Gary opened the latch, there were no wrenches or screwdrivers inside. There were photographs, envelopes, and a stack of small spiral notebooks, each dated in Carol's handwriting. Rachel immediately stepped back. We shouldn't read those. Gary picked up the oldest notebook, then stopped when a folded photograph slipped onto the floor. It showed me standing beside the fishing boat I had sold almost 20 years earlier. On the back, Carol had written one sentence. Walter sold the one thing he loved, so Gary would never know where the down payment came from. Gary read it twice. Then he slowly sat down on the hallway floor. What down payment? Rachel asked. His face had gone pale. My first house. And suddenly, the 43 missed calls on my phone were no longer the hardest thing my children had to face that morning. I woke just before 6 and reached across the bed without thinking. My hand landed on the cold side of the mattress where Carol had slept for 39 years. For a few seconds, I forgot she was gone. Then I saw the bandage around my forearm and remembered the fire, the train station, and the empty platform. My phone was still face down on the kitchen counter. I turned it over. 43 missed calls. 17 from Gary, 14 from Rachel. The rest came from Denise, relatives, neighbors, and numbers I didn't recognize. The messages were worse. Dad, please answer. Are you hurt? Where are you? We're coming over. I stood there reading their names and felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, exhaustion. When I had asked for one ride home, after scattering Carol's ashes, 2 people had been too busy. Now that strangers had watched me run into a burning shed, everyone suddenly had time. I put the phone back down. I wasn't trying to punish my children. I simply didn't have the strength to reassure them that morning. I made coffee, poured a second cup out of 39 years of habit, and stared at it before slowly emptying it into the sink. At 8, someone knocked. I expected Gary or Rachel, but Marisol Vega stood outside alone. No camera, no microphone. I'm not here for an interview, she said. I promised the hospital I'd tell you something. My stomach tightened. The boys? She smiled. Both are going to be fine. I closed my eyes and released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The younger one keeps asking about the man who broke the window. Tell him that man says broken glass is a terrible idea. Marisol laughed. Then her expression softened. There are reporters at the end of the block. The video went everywhere overnight. The fire department wants to recognize you. The mayor's office called too. I don't want recognition. What do you want? I looked toward Carol's empty chair. A quiet day. Marisol nodded. Then they won't get your address from me. After she left, I turned off my phone and walked down toward the river. I needed somewhere that didn't contain 39 years of memories in every room. What I didn't know was that Gary and Rachel were already driving toward my house. Gary still had the spare key I'd given him years earlier for emergencies. They let themselves inside and called my name. No answer. Rachel walked into the kitchen and stopped when she saw the dried flowers from Carol's memorial sitting in a small dish on the table. Gary noticed her reading glasses beside the chair by the window. Neither spoke. They had grown up in that house, but that morning they were seeing it differently, not as the place Dad would always be, but as the place he had been expected to return to alone. Rachel began straightening the kitchen simply to keep her hands moving. Gary stood by the window staring at his phone. I told him to take the train, he finally said. Rachel didn't answer. His wife had just been buried, and I told him to take the train. I told him he should have planned better. The words sounded even worse spoken aloud. Rachel went to the hallway closet looking for cleaning cloths. When she moved one of Carol's winter coats, something metal scraped across the floor. An old gray toolbox sat hidden behind it. Gary, was this Dad's? He shook his head. They pulled it into the hallway and opened it. There were no tools inside. Only photographs, sealed envelopes, and small spiral notebooks with dates written across their covers in Carol's handwriting. Rachel immediately said, "We shouldn't read these." Then, a photograph slipped from between 2 notebooks and landed face down. Gary picked it up. It showed me standing beside the fishing boat I had sold nearly 20 years earlier. He smiled sadly. Dad loved that boat. Then he turned the photograph over. Carol had written a single sentence on the back. Walter sold his boat so Gary could make the down payment on his first house. He made me promise our son would never know. Gary stopped breathing for a moment. That can't be right. Rachel looked at him. Did Dad give you money for the house? Gary slowly lowered himself onto the bottom stair. He told me it came from savings. He looked at the stack of Carol's notebooks. For the first time that morning, neither of them was thinking about the fire. They were beginning to realize there might be an entire version of their father's life they had never bothered to see. Gary opened the first notebook with both hands trembling. Rachel sat beside him on the hallway floor. The entry beside the photograph was dated 19 years earlier, 3 weeks before Gary closed on his first house. Carol had written, "Walter sold the boat today. Gary thinks the down payment money came from savings. Walter made me promise never to tell him. He said a father shouldn't turn help into a debt his son has to carry." Gary stared at the page. He loved that boat. Rachel remembered it too. Every summer I had taken them fishing before sunrise. When I sold it, I told everyone my knees were getting bad and I wasn't using it enough. Gary pressed his fingers against his eyes. I never even asked why he stopped fishing. Rachel reached for another notebook. Several years later, Carol had written about Rachel's divorce. Legal fees had been crushing her while she was raising 2 children. Rachel remembered me giving her a check and saying Carol and I had decided to simplify our finances. The notebook told a different story. Walter withdrew money from his retirement account today to cover Rachel's attorney. He told her it was extra savings because he knows she would refuse it otherwise. Rachel's voice broke. "I thought you and Mom had plenty." Gary looked at her. "So did I." They kept reading. One entry explained why I returned to weekend shifts after retirement. I had told everyone I was bored at home. Carol wrote that Gary's small business had nearly collapsed during a terrible winter, and I quietly worked extra shifts so I could help him meet payroll without telling him where the money came from. Another entry explained the old pickup truck I drove for more than a decade. I had planned to replace it, but Rachel's oldest daughter needed braces. Then her younger child needed them too. "Walter says the truck still starts," Carol had written. "Apparently that means it can survive another 6 years." Rachel laughed through her tears. "I used to tease him about that truck." Gary didn't laugh. He was staring at another page. It was about the Grand Canyon. Carol and I had talked about making that trip for years. Gary remembered buying us a guidebook for Christmas and joking that we would never actually go. According to Carol, we had booked the trip once. Then college tuition rose unexpectedly. I canceled it and told the children Carol preferred Cape May anyway. "Dad gave up all of this?" Gary whispered. Rachel shook her head. "No. Dad gave it up and made sure we never knew." That distinction silenced them. The notebooks weren't a record of grand gestures. They were a record of hundreds of small decisions, made quietly over decades, overtime instead of vacations, repairs instead of replacements, old coats instead of new ones, money redirected before either child ever knew there was a problem. There was never a complaint beside any of it. Carol occasionally sounded frustrated with me for hiding too much. In one entry she wrote, "Walter thinks protecting the children means never letting them see what protection costs." Gary closed the notebook, and last night he asked me for one ride. Rachel looked down, and we made him feel like a burden. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Rachel noticed one notebook separated from the others. It was newer. The cover carried dates from Carol's final 18 months. She hesitated before opening it. The early pages described appointments, chemotherapy, medication, good mornings, followed by terrible afternoons. Then money began appearing between the medical notes. Insurance limits, treatment bills, a clinical trial, savings being transferred. Rachel turned another page and stopped. "Gary." He looked over. Carol had written about the day I learned one more treatment might buy her additional time, but the cost would be enormous. I had apparently asked only one question. Does she have a chance? When the doctor said yes, I signed the paperwork. Gary whispered, "How much?" Rachel kept reading. Carol had discovered later that I had emptied nearly everything remaining in our personal savings. I never told her. Instead, every time she worried about the bills, I smiled and said, "We're fine." Rachel covered her mouth. Gary stared toward the empty kitchen where Carol used to make coffee every morning. Then Rachel reached the final paragraph on the page. She started reading silently, but halfway through, tears blurred her vision. "Read it," Gary said. "I can't." She handed him the notebook. Gary looked down at Carol's handwriting. The entry had been written only 5 months before she died. He read the first sentence, then stopped. Whatever Carol had written there wasn't about money anymore. It was about me, and about the one thing she feared Gary and Rachel might understand, only after she was gone. Gary held the notebook for several seconds before he could continue. Carol's handwriting was weaker on that page, the letters uneven in places, but the words were unmistakably hers. "If I don't make it, I worry the children will misunderstand Walter. He has spent his whole life making sacrifice look effortless. They see the old truck, the missed vacations, the extra shifts, and think he simply doesn't want much. The truth is that almost everything he ever wanted came second to us." Gary stopped reading. Rachel covered her mouth, but he forced himself to continue. "Walter will never tell them what he gave up. He thinks love stops being love the moment you keep score. I only hope that when I'm gone, Gary and Rachel never mistake his silence for indifference. Underneath that quiet is the biggest heart I have ever known." Gary lowered the notebook. Neither of them spoke. The house around them suddenly seemed full of evidence they had ignored for years. My old work boots by the back door, the jacket I had worn every winter for nearly a decade, the kitchen cabinets I repaired instead of replacing, the photographs of vacations I paid for but rarely joined because somebody had to stay behind and work. Rachel began crying first. "I thought he was just stubborn." Gary stared at the floor. "I thought he was cheap." The words sounded ugly now. He remembered birthdays when I handed him an envelope instead of buying something for myself. Weekends when I appeared at his business before sunrise because he needed help. Calls at midnight that always ended with me saying, "No problem. I'm on my way." Rachel remembered her divorce differently now. She had called me from a courthouse parking lot, terrified she couldn't afford another month of legal bills. I had arrived 40 minutes later with coffee and told her not to worry about money. She never asked where it came from. "He never made us feel guilty," she whispered. "Not once." Gary looked toward the front door. "And yesterday he asked me for one thing." Rachel knew exactly what he meant. One ride. One familiar face waiting at the station after I scattered Carol's ashes. Gary unlocked his phone and found my message again, pulling in at 6. "Any chance one of you can swing by?" Beneath it sat his answer. "Kind of swamped tonight. Just take the train home." Rachel opened hers. "You really should have told us earlier so we could plan around it." She began sobbing. What kind of daughter says that? Denise, who had arrived while they were reading, sat beside her. A daughter who thought there would always be another chance to do better. That was the part none of them could escape. I had always been there. So reliably, so quietly, that my presence had become something they assumed instead of something they valued. Gary suddenly stood. "I'm calling him." Rachel grabbed his arm. "What are you going to say?" He looked at Carol's notebook. "I don't know," he called anyway. Across town, I was sitting alone on a bench, overlooking the river when my phone vibrated. Gary's name appeared. I almost let it ring out. Then I remembered Carol telling me years ago that silence could protect a person, but it could also become a wall, I answered. For several seconds, all I heard was Gary breathing. Then his voice broke. "Dad, I'm here." Another long silence. Finally, 4 words came through the phone. "Dad, please come home." I closed my eyes. The night before, I would have given almost anything to hear those words. Now they arrived after a burning shed, a television report, and 43 missed calls. "Did you find your mother's notebooks?" I asked. Gary started crying harder. "Yes." "Then you know things I never intended you to carry." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because helping my son wasn't alone." "Dad, I'm sorry." I looked across the moving water. Part of me wanted to tell him it was all right, because that was what I had done my entire life whenever my children hurt. Make it smaller, make it easier. Say no problem even when there was one. But Carol was gone now, and maybe protecting my children from every consequence had helped create this moment. "I love you, Gary," I said, "but I'm not ready to come home yet." He went quiet. "Where are you?" "Somewhere I need to be alone for a while." "Can I come get you?" The question nearly broke me. Not today. I ended the call gently and placed the phone beside me. Back at the house, Gary stared at the dark screen while Rachel held Carol's final notebook against her chest. For the first time, my children understood that an apology could be sincere and still arrive too late to erase the wound. And for the first time in my life, I was allowing them to feel the weight I had always carried for them. After I ended the call with Gary, I stayed on the river bench until the afternoon light began disappearing behind the buildings. My phone buzzed several more times, but I didn't answer. I wasn't trying to make my children suffer. I was trying to understand why hearing "Dad, please come home" hurt almost as much as being left alone at the station. For 39 years, Carol had been the person who noticed when I was pretending to be fine. Without her, I wasn't sure anyone had noticed me at all, until a burning shed forced them to. Rachel eventually sent one message. "Dad, I found Mom's notebooks. I'm sorry I never asked what things cost you. I read it twice and put the phone away. There would be time for apologies. I just wasn't ready to make them easy." Near sunset, Marisol called. "I know you said no more reporters." I did. "I'm not asking you to become a headline. I'm asking you to stop other people from writing your story for you." She explained that television stations were already filling in the blanks. Some claimed I had been homeless. Others said I had been wandering the neighborhood after my wife died. One even suggested my family had abandoned me completely. "None of that is true," I said. "Exactly. Give me 20 minutes tomorrow. One camera, no dramatic music, no questions you don't want to answer." I hesitated. "Why does any of this matter?" Marisol was quiet before answering. "Because everyone understands loneliness, Walter. Very few people admit it." That sentence sounded like something Carol might have said. Then Marisol told me her mother had died in a care facility during the pandemic, and she never got the goodbye she expected to have. I learned the hard way that we always think there'll be another visit. I looked at the river. 20 minutes. That's all. The next morning we met in a quiet room at the fire station. 2 folding chairs, 1 camera. Marisol kept her promise. She asked about the boys first. Then she asked why I had gone into the shed. "Because somebody needed to. You knew it could kill you. 4 days earlier, I watched the woman I loved die after 18 months of fighting to stay alive. Fear feels different after that." Marisol let the silence sit between us. "Were you thinking about Carol when you went inside?" "The whole time." I looked down at my wedding ring. She would have never forgiven me if I stood outside while another mother lost her children. Then came the question I knew she eventually had to ask. "Walter, reports say you were walking home from the station that evening. Did your family know you were coming back?" For 1 second, I saw Gary's text again. "Just take the train home." Then Rachel's. "You should have told us earlier." I could have repeated both sentences on camera. I could have told thousands of strangers that my children had been too busy to pick up their father after he scattered their mother's ashes. Nobody could have called me a liar. Marisol waited. The camera kept recording. Finally, I said, "My kids have a lot on their plates." She studied me. Meaning? Jobs. Children. Responsibilities. They're building their own lives. Sometimes people get busy and don't realize what they've missed until afterward. Are you angry with them? I thought about it. I've had enough sadness this week. I don't need to stack anger on top of it. Marisol didn't push. The interview ended 10 minutes later. I assumed that would be the end of the story. I was wrong. By that evening, the rescue footage was no longer the part everyone was sharing. It was those 7 words. My kids have a lot on their plates. Thousands of people heard a father protecting the same children who had failed to show up for him. And across town, Gary and Rachel were about to hear me defend them before the entire city knew what they had done. Gary watched my interview alone in his truck outside his office. Rachel watched from her kitchen with her youngest daughter Emma sitting beside her. Neither of them knew what I had told Marisol before the segment aired. They knew I could have exposed everything. I could have repeated their texts word for word and let an entire city decide what kind of children leave their grieving father at a station hours after he scattered their mother's ashes. Instead, they heard me say, "My kids have a lot on their plates." Gary lowered his head. The reporter asked whether I was angry. My answer came next. I've had enough sadness this week. I don't need to stack anger on top of it. Gary paused the video. He sat behind the steering wheel, staring at nothing. His phone was full of messages praising his father, yet all he could see was the text he had sent me. Just take the train home. I had protected him publicly when he hadn't even given me a ride privately. At Rachel's house, Emma looked up at her mother. "Grandpa's talking about you, right?" Rachel swallowed. "Yes. Why is he saying nice things if you hurt his feelings?" Rachel opened her mouth but couldn't answer. Children have a way of asking the question adults spend years avoiding. She replayed the clip and listened again. I never accused them, never embarrassed them, never even hinted that I had been disappointed. Somehow, that mercy hurt more than public humiliation would have. By evening, the sentence, "They've got a lot on their plates," had spread far beyond the original rescue video. People posted stories about mothers they had forgotten to call, fathers they kept postponing visits with, grandparents who always said they understood. One woman wrote that her mother used the exact same phrase every time she canceled Sunday dinner. Another said she booked a flight home after watching the interview. I knew none of that yet. I had turned off the television and spent the afternoon repairing a loose hinge on my back gate because working with my hands was easier than becoming somebody's lesson. But the neighborhood had begun changing around me. Someone left a casserole on my porch. Another person trimmed the hedge without knocking. A boy from 3 houses down raked the leaves. Cards appeared beneath the door from people I barely knew. None asked for photographs. None called me a hero. They simply showed up. Carol would have liked that. Late that afternoon, Marisol called. "You should know that your interview is getting more attention than the fire." "That makes no sense. People understand what you didn't say." I looked toward Carol's chair. Maybe they're hearing too much. Or maybe they're finally hearing the right thing. After we hung up, I decided to walk home from the hardware store instead of taking the bus. When I turned onto my street, I saw 2 people sitting on folding chairs outside my house. Gary was on the left, Rachel on the right. No phones in their hands, no spouses beside them, no excuses waiting between them. They stood when they saw me, but neither rushed forward. Gary looked like he hadn't slept. Rachel's eyes were swollen. I stopped at the bottom of the steps. "How long have you been sitting there?" "About 2 hours, Gary said. "Why didn't you use the spare key?" He looked down. It didn't feel like our ride anymore. That answer told me the notebooks had done something my anger never could. Rachel held out my canvas bag from Cape May. "You left this inside." Carol's cardigan was folded carefully on top. I took the bag but said nothing. Gary finally whispered, "Dad, why did you protect us on television?" I looked at my son, then my daughter. "Because public shame doesn't heal a private wound." Rachel began crying. "Then how do we heal it?" For most of their lives, I would have answered that question for them. This time, I unlocked the door and stepped aside. "Come inside," I said. "And for once, let's stop pretending nothing happened." Behind us, the 2 folding chairs remained empty on the porch. Inside waited Carol's notebooks, 39 years of memories, and the conversation our family should have had, long before strangers needed to remind us what showing up meant. We sat at the same kitchen table where Carol had served 39 Thanksgiving dinners. For the first time I could remember, nobody had a phone beside their plate. Gary sat across from me. Rachel held one of Carol's notebooks against her chest. Between us were 3 cups of coffee slowly going cold. Gary spoke first. "Why didn't you ever tell me about the boat?" I looked at him. "What would telling you have changed? I would have paid you back." "That's exactly why I didn't tell you." His face tightened. "Dad, you gave up something you loved. I sold a boat. You bought a home for your family. I thought I got the better end of that deal." Gary looked away. Rachel opened the notebook. "And my divorce? You took money from your retirement. You needed a lawyer. You needed retirement. I still retired." She almost smiled, then started crying again. "That's what Mom meant. You make everything sound like it cost you nothing." I looked toward Carol's empty chair. "Your mother and I made those decisions together." Rachel shook her head. "That doesn't explain why you hid all of it." I thought about the answer before speaking. "Because I never wanted either of you measuring my love in dollars. Parents help their children. I didn't need receipts." Gary leaned forward. But we should have noticed. That was different. I didn't disagree. Yes, I said quietly. You should have. The room went silent. Gary swallowed hard. When you texted me from the station, I was home. I looked at him. I wasn't swamped. Denise and I were having dinner. I just didn't want to drive across town. Rachel wiped her face. And I could have gone too. I had work the next morning, the kids had practice, and I decided it was inconvenient. Neither excuse surprised me. Hearing them admit it still hurt. Do you know what I wanted that night? I asked. Not a ride. I could get myself home. I wanted one of you standing on that platform because I had just left your mother in the ocean, and I didn't know how to walk into our house without her. Rachel began sobbing. Gary stared at the table. Why didn't you say that? Because I shouldn't have had to explain why that day was hard. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Gary asked the question that had followed him since the interview. Why didn't you tell Marisol what we did? I looked at both of them. Because public shame doesn't heal a private wound. But we deserved it, Rachel said. Maybe. But accountability should lead somewhere. Your mother believed that. If all I did was make strangers hate you, what would we have fixed? Gary's eyes filled. Can you forgive us? There it was, the question I knew would come. Years earlier, I would have answered immediately. I would have said, of course, told them not to worry, and made their guilt disappear before they had learned anything from it. This time I didn't. I can forgive you, I said. But forgiveness isn't pretending the station never happened. Gary nodded slowly. Rachel reached across the table. Then what do we do? You show up differently. How? I shouldn't have to give you instructions. That landed harder than anger. Gary wiped his face. You're right. I looked at my children and finally said something Carol had tried to teach me for years. I made a mistake too. I spent your whole lives making every sacrifice invisible. I thought that was love. Maybe sometimes it was. But I also taught you that Dad never needed anything. Rachel shook her head. That still doesn't excuse us. No, it doesn't. But if we're going to fix this family, everybody tells the truth. Gary reached into his pocket and placed the spare key to my house on the table. I don't think I should have this anymore. I pushed it back toward him. Keep it. He stared at me. After everything, a key isn't forgiveness. It's responsibility. If I call because I need you, use it. Gary closed his fingers around the key and began crying. Rachel stood and came around the table. She didn't ask whether I forgave her again. She simply wrapped her arms around me. Gary joined us a moment later. For the first time since Carol died, I let my children hold me, without pretending I was the strong one. A few days later, I asked them to drive somewhere with me. I didn't tell them where. Gary drove, while Rachel sat beside me. 2 hours later, when the Cape May Pier appeared through the windshield, neither asked why we had come. We walked to the place where I had scattered Carol's ashes. Gary stood beside the railing for a long time before whispering, Mom, I'm sorry. Rachel took my hand. The wind moved across the water, and for once I didn't feel like I was standing there alone. Gary stood at the end of the Cape May Pier, staring at the water where I had scattered Carol's ashes. Mom, he said quietly, Dad asked me for one ride, and I couldn't even give him that. I'm sorry. Rachel stepped beside him. I kept thinking there would always be another Sunday, another dinner, another chance to show up. The wind carried her words out over the water. I didn't tell them Carol forgave them. I couldn't speak for her. I simply put an arm around each of them and stood there until none of us had anything left to say. What happened afterward mattered more than any apology. Gary started arriving every Tuesday morning with 2 coffees. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we worked silently in the garage. He never called first to ask whether I needed anything. He simply showed up. Rachel began coming Sunday evenings with soup she insisted was made from Carol's recipe. It never tasted quite right. What am I missing? She asked one night. Patience, I told her. Your mother never treated that as optional. She laughed, and for a moment the house sounded alive again. My granddaughter Emma started spending Saturdays with me. One afternoon she asked me to teach her how to build something, so we made a birdhouse. It came out crooked enough that even the birds might have questioned the engineering. Emma apologized. I turned it over in my hands and said, families aren't perfectly square either. If the foundation is strong enough, they can still stand. A month after the fire, the department invited me to speak at a community safety event. I nearly refused until I remembered something Carol used to say. If something painful can help another person, eventually it stops belonging only to you. Near the end, a woman asked what made me run toward the burning shed when everyone else stayed back. I thought about the answer. My wife spent 18 months fighting to stay alive, I said. After watching someone you love fight that hard for another day, you stop assuming tomorrow is guaranteed. I looked across the crowd and saw Gary and Rachel standing near the back. Most families don't fall apart because of one enormous betrayal. It happens through smaller things. A call you'll return tomorrow. A dinner you cancel because you're tired. A visit you postpone until next month. You keep believing there'll always be another chance. The room became quiet. 4 days after my wife died, I asked my children for a ride home. They didn't come. I was hurt. But I also spent years telling them I never needed anything. We all learned something from that night. Gary lowered his head. Rachel reached for his hand. The fire taught people the wrong lesson about me, I continued. They called me brave because I ran into a burning building, but running toward someone who needs you shouldn't require flames. Sometimes courage is noticing the quiet person who always says, "I'm fine," and asking twice. Afterward, I went home without a medal or ceremony. I didn't need either. Carol's chair was still empty, and some evenings the silence still hurt enough to stop me in the hallway. Healing hadn't erased grief. It had simply given grief somewhere to live without taking the whole house with it. Gary kept showing up on Tuesdays. Rachel kept coming Sundays. Emma's crooked birdhouse hung beside the garage. And whenever I looked at it, I remembered that families can lean badly and still be repaired if people stop pretending the cracks aren't there. So if there is someone you've been meaning to call them today. If there is someone you keep assuming will always be waiting, go see them. Don't wait for a hospital room, an empty station platform, or a burning building to teach you what their presence was worth. Sometimes there is another chance. Sometimes there isn't. I was fortunate enough to get one, and this time, none of us intended to waste it.